June 18th, 1429, somewhere near Patay, north of Orleans, the heart of France. The Hundred Years' War seemed to stretch on forever, but on this day it hung by a thread, ready to break or tie itself into a new deadly knot. English archers, legendary masters of the battlefield, frantically drive sharpened stakes into the hard, unyielding ground. Their backs are tense, their faces covered in sweat, every movement desperate, for they know the seconds are slipping away. Their famous palisade is their only hope against the encroaching death. Picture yourself as one of them. Feel your hands shake with exhaustion, the stake sinking into the earth, stubbornly refusing to yield. The air hums with anticipation, thick and heavy, charged with the coming storm. And then, over the hills, through the dense woods, a sound emerges. First, a faint hum, then it builds. A thunderous, deafening roar. It's not just approaching, it's bearing down. On the horizon, like a surging tide of steel and fury, the French cavalry emerges, an unstoppable wave glinting with armor, charging with unbelievable speed, a speed that in previous centuries would have been suicidal. Hundreds, thousands of hooves thunder across the earth, and every impact is a verdict. The French, who for centuries had been shattered by English arrow fire, now carry something new within them, something terrifying. This is no mere skirmish. This is the culmination of the entire Loire campaign, the final monstrous chord that will decide the fate of the continent. What happened? How did an army once thought invincible find itself caught off guard, its renowned tactics shattered? This was more than just a battle, it was a catastrophic blow to English ambitions in France. This is the story of how a furious cavalry charge, bolstered by new tactics and an overwhelming surge in morale, crushed the legendary superiority of English archers, changing the course of the war and the very destiny of an entire nation. But to understand the true scale of this tragedy and triumph, we must first look at the much broader picture, the war that changed the world. The Battle of Patay was far more than just a bloody skirmish in rural France. It was a turning point, a colossal tectonic shift in the Hundred Years' War, an event that forever fundamentally altered the art of war and the very psychology of two great powers. Imagine a set of scales on which for decades the English longbow had dominated, tipping the balance of victory in every battle. On this day, those scales came crashing down. For the English, Patay became an unprecedented disaster, their most devastating defeat since the Battle of Beaujeu in 1421, but with far more profound and irreversible consequences. It wasn't just a loss, it instantly shattered their myth of invincibility. The field of Patay mercilessly exposed the limits of the longbow's effectiveness as an ultimate military weapon, revealing its fatal vulnerability when conditions were not ideal and the enemy acted swiftly and unpredictably. For the French, however, Patay became a stunning resurgence, a long-awaited, fierce revenge for the humiliating Agincourt, where their chivalry had been decimated by English arrows. More than just a victory, it was a surge of rage that cast off the shackles of fear and despair. In an instant, their pride was restored, their fighting spirit soared, and their self-confidence became as steely as their armor once more. The psychological advantage, which the English had held for decades, now shifted to France. The map of Europe began to change. But to understand how France, seemingly doomed to defeat, managed to achieve such a triumph, we must go back in time and immerse ourselves in the brutal context of this grueling war, which drained the lifeblood from two nations. Imagine France in the year 1428. It wasn't a unified nation, but a kingdom torn apart, occupied, and bleeding out in the endless Hundred Years' War. The English lion seemed to have finally sunk its claws into its northern lands. Virtually all of France north of the Loire River, a crucial waterway, was under the iron grip of the English. Every bridge, every strategic crossing was in their hands, like a sword of Damocles hanging over the remnants of French statehood. The French army? It was more a collection of demoralized, fragmented factions than a unified force. Torn apart from within by a deadly civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, it was merely a pale shadow of its former glory, desperately clinging to its southern territories. And then, in October of 1428, a critical moment arrived. The English, sensing ultimate victory was within their grasp, launched a massive siege of Orleans. This city was the last stronghold, the last hope of the Dauphin Charles, and the de facto capital of his fragmented kingdom. If Orléans fell, French resistance would be utterly shattered, and France might well have vanished from the map of Europe as an independent nation. The stakes were incredibly high. But history, as we know, often has a way of surprising us. In the spring of 1429, as despair reached its peak, a figure emerged. Joan of Arc, a simple peasant girl whose unwavering faith and indomitable will ignited an incredible fire in the hearts of the demoralized soldiers. Fueled by her fervent inspiration, the French forces, as if roused from a deep slumber, achieved the impossible. In May 1429, the siege of Orléans was lifted, marking the first monumental shift as in the course of the war. This was not the end, but merely a dramatic beginning. Like a predator sensing weakness, the French army, now driven by a new aggressive spirit, launched into an unstoppable Loire campaign. In a matter of days, they captured one English position after another. On June 12th, Jargeau fell. On June 15th, the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire was taken, and on the same day, Beaugency was besieged. The English garrisons, once thought impregnable, were now crumbling under the assault. Lord Talbot and Sir John Fastolf, seasoned English commanders, rushed to their aid with reinforcements from Paris, but they were too late. The garrison of Beaugency, unaware of Fastolf's approach, surrendered on June 18th. The English faced the terrifying prospect of being surrounded. Retreat became their only option. They turned north towards Paris, hoping to evade the pursuing French armada. But the French, consumed by a thirst for victory, were already close. It was at this very moment, as the English forces, exhausted and weakened, were attempting to evade pursuit, that their paths crossed. Near the small village of Patay, destiny itself brought them face to face. This was no accident, but an inevitable clash of two worlds, the old fading era of English dominance and the new fervent era of French resurgence. But how did this seemingly fragmented and demoralized French army manage to transform into such a lethal machine, capable of such lightning-fast and decisive actions? What was their secret formula for victory that enabled them to defy decades of English dominance? How then did France, after years of suffering, humiliating defeats, manage to transform so radically? The secret to its sudden, stunning strength lay not only in numerical superiority, but also in a fundamental, brutal change in tactics, and critically, in a rebirth of its fighting spirit. Morale is to the physical as 3-1, as Napoleon once said. And it was this moral effect that Joan of Arc brought to the army. She was not a supreme commander, she didn't directly issue tactical orders, but her unwavering faith, her absolute conviction in a divine mission, breathed new life into demoralized hearts. She persistently demanded aggressive action, persuading, coaxing, and at times shaming wavering generals. Her words and actions instilled in the French troops an unprecedented aggressive spirit and an unstoppable moral impetus, transforming them from a collection of desperate individuals into a unified, purposeful machine. But spirit alone would not be enough. French commanders, such as La Hire and Jean Poton de Xaintrailles, finally abandoned suicidal frontal assaults on prepared English positions, which for centuries had led to disasters like Agincourt. They had learned a harsh lesson. Now their strategy was different: surprise the enemy. They aimed to attack the English on the march, during deployment, or in their camps, when they couldn't prepare their legendary defensive formations. Their new tactics were based on lightning speed and the overwhelming maneuverability of their heavy cavalry. The French vanguard, led by La Hire and Xaintrailles, was an elite shock force. It consisted of 180 hand-picked knights and 1,300 men-at-arms who operated with unprecedented cohesion and swiftness. They were capable of lightning-fast, crushing flank attacks, shattering the enemy lines before they could even react. The contrast with the English army was striking. The English, by contrast, clung to outdated, yet once triumphant tactics of Crécy and Agincourt, deploying thousands of archers behind an impenetrable palisade of sharpened stakes. This system had worked flawlessly in the past, but it required time, discipline, and ideal terrain. Their archers at Patay were no longer the hardened veterans of Agincourt. Less experienced, less disciplined, they faced a fatal weakness: slow deployment, unprepared positions, and catastrophically vulnerable flanks. The English overconfidence in the longbow's invincibility in open battle, their stubborn adherence to old methods, led them directly to an inevitable disaster when they encountered the new, ruthless French tactics. And so, at this deadly crossroads of history, two armies converged. One, reborn in the fire of faith and tactical innovation; the other, bound by the chains of past glory. What then transpired on the field where the ground was soaked with hope and despair? Exhausted by a relentless retreat, slowed down by a cumbersome baggage train and the weight of its own ambitions, the English army, numbering around 3,000 men, was desperately seeking salvation. They needed more than just ground. They needed an impregnable defensive position that could halt the rapid French advance. Their eyes fell upon the terrain near Patay, hilly fields dotted with small groves and hedgerows. They hoped this topography would force the French to attack uphill, directly into a deadly hail of arrows, as it had been at Crécy or Agincourt. It was a proven formula for victory. Imagine yourself as an English soldier. The weight of your armor is suffocating under the scorching sun, and the fatigue from miles of marching aches in every bone. Lord Talbot, a battle-hardened commander, deployed about 500 archers in a small, barely noticeable depression. Behind them, on a gentle ridge, Sir John Fastolf positioned the main forces. This was meant to be their impregnable fortress. Archers, their hands calloused and their faces contorted with strain, feverishly drove pointed stakes into the hard, unyielding earth. Every hammer blow rang in their ears like a bell tolling the final moments of calm, but progress was agonizingly slow. The earth resisted, time was slipping away, and, most fatally, the flanks remained utterly exposed. There were none of the natural barriers, ravines, bogs that had made the positions at Crécy and Agincourt so impregnable. Around 2 in the afternoon, while the English archers were still grappling with the terrain, the French vanguard, led by La Hire and Xaintrailles, crested a small rise. Before them lay the English positions, but they were still unprepared. And then came what would forever be known as the deer effect. A lone, noble stag, startled by French patrols, burst noisily through the line of English archers, and they, driven by old hunting instincts, couldn't resist. Across the field rang out a booming, triumphant hunting cry. In this one decisive moment, their positions were irrevocably exposed. All the cover provided by the trees and bushes was rendered useless. French scouts immediately realized that the enemy was right in front of them, and they were unprepared. What now? The French vanguard, an elite wave of steel, had already seen them. The curtain had risen, and the bloody spectacle was about to begin. Would this be another battle where numbers and bravery would shatter against the English longbow? Or would the new French tactics, their ferocious speed, finally crush the myth of invincibility? The answer came instantly, and it was terrifying. A resounding hunting cry that rang out over the fields of Patay was not just a sound to the French, but an immediate call to action. The vanguard, under the command of La Hire and Xaintrailles, 180 elite knights, the finest horsemen in France, instantly pinpointed the English position. Not a second of hesitation, no consultations, no waiting for the main force. This was the moment when the new French doctrine was to be put into practice. Shattering expectations, the French elite cavalry, like an arrow shot, charged down the slope without hesitation. Thousands of pounds of steel and muscle, driven by a single will, slammed into the unsuspecting enemy. The English archers, caught off guard, couldn't even finish their crucial preparations. Their stakes were only partially set, turning them not into an impregnable fortress, but into a deadly trap. Their flanks, they were wide open, an open invitation to attack. The terrifying thunder of hooves drowned out everything, turning screams into silent moans. This was a pivotal maneuver, a lightning-fast, flanking cavalry attack against the unprepared positions of the English archers. The French cavalry, advancing with incredible speed, crashed into the archer ranks not head-on, but from their unprotected flanks, where their light armor could not withstand heavy spears and swords. Thousands of arrows, which could have decided the outcome of the battle, remained in their quivers. The archers, whose skill was legendary, found themselves helpless in hand-to-hand combat against armored knights. They were literally swept from the face of the earth. And as if that wasn't enough, right on the heels of the first wave appeared the main French vanguard. Another 1,300 armored knights who were closing in on the English from the rear, completing the circle of hell. The psychological collapse occurred in an instant. The archers were overwhelmed in a matter of seconds, their ranks shattered, and they themselves cut off from the main force. Witnessing this unbelievable, unprecedented carnage, the English vanguard, tasked with covering the archers, panicked and fled. Sir John Fastolf, realizing the catastrophic failure, was forced to follow suit. The legendary Lord Talbot, a pillar of the English army, was captured while attempting to mount his horse, a clear sign of his utter unpreparedness for such a sudden and ferocious assault. The battle devolved into a ruthless slaughter. The heavy French cavalry, like predators, hunted down the fleeing, lightly armed English soldiers. It was no longer a battle, but a bloody slaughter, a widespread massacre. There was virtually no organized resistance. The outcome was decided in a matter of minutes. The fields of Patay became a graveyard of English military glory. The myth of the longbow's invincibility was shattered. The French, who had suffered for centuries from its deadly power, finally found a way to overcome it. But what were the long-term consequences of this shocking victory? The Battle of Patay was a decisive French victory, and without exaggeration, a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions for the English. The numbers speak for themselves, painting a picture of absolute devastation. Over 2,000 English soldiers were killed, and between 2,500 and 4,000 were killed or captured. In comparison, the French lost fewer than 100 men. This was not just a defeat, it was complete annihilation. The political consequences were immediate and devastating. Almost all senior English commanders, including the legendary John Talbot, Thomas, Baron Scales, and Sir Thomas Remston, were taken prisoner. Earlier at Jargeau, the Earl of Suffolk had been captured, and during the siege of Orléans, the Earl of Salisbury was killed. This led to the virtual annihilation of the English field army in central France. Its leadership was decapitated, and its backbone was shattered. From this blow, English positions in France never recovered, beginning a slow but inexorable decline. The map of Europe began to visibly transform. In the following weeks, as English resistance became negligible, the French, like an avalanche, swiftly recaptured vast territories to the south, east, and north of Paris. But the most symbolic and politically significant event was their triumphant march on Reims. On July the 17th, 1429, just a month after Patay, in Reims Cathedral, the Dauphin Charles was solemnly crowned as Charles VII, King of France. Joan of Arc had fulfilled her prophecy, lending legitimacy to a monarch who, until recently, had been merely a struggling dauphin. This marked an irreversible turning point in the war. The cultural and mythological consequences were also immense. Sir John Fastolf, who had managed to flee the battlefield, found his reputation gravely undermined by accusations of desertion. Although he was eventually acquitted, his name became a symbol of the shattering of English military supremacy. This incident, widely debated by his contemporaries, vividly illustrated the loss of that very unshakable confidence which had for centuries secured victories for the English. The Battle of Patay marked the definitive collapse of English dominance in open battle, paving the way for the coronation of Charles VII and irrevocably changing the course of the 100 Years' War in France's favor. This was precisely the turning point France had been waiting for decades. But what ultimately can this bloody, lightning-fast battle teach us, people of the 21st century, about the nature of war, leadership, and human destiny? What lesson can be learned from the fields of Patay? The Battle of Patay is more than just a page in a history textbook. It's a stark, brutal lesson about the fragility of even the most dominant military systems. For decades, the English had dominated battlefields, their longbow considered the ultimate weapon, but in a single day, their unshakable superiority was shattered. This battle demonstrated that blind, stubborn adherence to outdated tactics, even if they had yielded tremendous success in the past, inevitably leads to catastrophic defeat when the enemy dares to innovate and embrace an aggressive spirit. Imagine how the world changes when what was once considered insurmountable suddenly proves vulnerable. The longbow's vulnerability to a swift flanking cavalry charge, especially when archers couldn't establish their defensive positions in time, was conclusively and irrevocably proven on the fields of Patay. This was the end of an era when steel walls of arrows could single-handedly halt an onslaught. But it wasn't just tactics that changed the course of events. The moral effect that Joan of Arc had on the French army was truly incalculable. She transformed a demoralized, fragmented force into an unstoppable, relentless machine, ready to fight to its last breath. Her unwavering faith and indomitable spirit underscore the decisive role of leadership and the power of conviction in the darkest of times. It was she who gave the French the very spark that ignited the blaze of victory. And finally, Pate reminds us of the unpredictable role of chance. The Deer Effect Museum in Pate is a powerful reminder that even a random event, a startled deer letting out a cry, can have enormous cascading consequences, changing the course of history for entire nations. One moment, one sound, and the world is turned upside down. Patay's ultimate lesson for our time is that adaptability, innovation, and an indomitable spirit can shatter even the most entrenched dominance. History's unforgiving lesson is clear. Those who cling to the past, who fail to see evolving realities, are destined to be swept away by the tide of change. In a world where technology and ideas advance with breathtaking speed, the capacity for flexibility and reinvention is no longer just an advantage, but a matter of survival. Pate is more than just a battle story. It's an epic saga of how one nation found the strength to redefine itself, while another, clinging to its past glories, was buried under the rubble of its own overconfidence. It's a timeless lesson, etched in steel across the fields of France.